Right, good morning. Thanks to Genia, thanks to Jack and Lenya for their presentations, and welcome to this presentation of my research project addressing trade and supply chain disruptions in the context of nuclear winter scenarios. I would like to thank everyone here at ERA, my research manager in particular, and finally my mentor, Paul. So yeah, today I'll take you through these three sections. First looking a bit at what it is that I've been researching and why I think it's important. Then a bit about how I decided to structure it and how I arrived at that structure before commenting on how we can move forward from here. So yeah, I imagine quite a few people have heard about nuclear winters, if it's through video games or forum posts or whatever, but I figured I'd walk you through it anyway. The idea is that after a nuclear exchange of a certain magnitude, you have a large amount of soot being ejected into the atmosphere, and long story short, for more than a decade, this will cause blockage of solar radiation, leading to temperature drops and essentially mouse crop failure. And as shown by these beautiful arrows, this leads to large amounts of deaths. And it's not one death like this skull would indicate, but as you can see here, several millions or even billions of deaths. And my scope has been smaller and moderate nuclear winter scenarios. So yeah, what is a TSC? First of all, I made up this abbreviation myself, although SC is often used for supply chains. I want to merge trade and supply chains, and that's because these two concepts are very interlinked in highly complex systems. So although trade refers to the exchange of goods on a global scale, and supply chains refers more to, well, the complex processes and systems that enable the distribution and production of these goods. They are highly interconnected, and as a matter of fact, this map is just an illustration. It only really shows trade, because really putting supply chains into an illustration will be very hard given the complexity of the systems. So yeah, what I think is important, as we've learned from a couple of presentations already, nuclear risk is pretty real, and you have IR experts claiming that nuclear tension these days are higher than they've ever been, although that is debated. And then, as shown by the table earlier, we got billions of lives at risk from the nuclear winter scenarios that could follow a nuclear exchange. And finally, we are very dependent on the TSC systems that I just talked about. About 80% of the world's population needs food trade to fill their nutritional needs, and 1 in 6 human beings are dependent on food trade to avoid starvation. So yeah, we've got a pretty serious risk of global hunger crisis and societal collapse here, yet there's almost no existing literature on the intersection between trade and supply chains and nuclear winters, which I found pretty weird, because as I approached this, I figured that, okay, if we know that we're very dependent on crops and crop failure leads to deaths, and we know that we're very dependent on global trade, this means that we can just kind of research these arrows to the right here, and then kind of quantify a number that we can present to policymakers, and then there you go, that'll be it. What I discovered quite early on was that it looks something more like this. Once you look at both supply chains and nuclear winters together, we got hyper complex systems. And this is because this is not only food trade, although this is what is mapped in this particular map. It's also things such as fertilizers, fuel, agrochemicals, all the things that feed back in these feedback loops and, well, again, complex systems. And not only does this mean that we need to disentangle this, it also raises questions about the initial research done on crop modeling and agriculture modeling, which again ties into the amount of death and such. And finally, it's not just some white space to the right here. This implies that we have serious literature gaps that needs to be addressed. There are neglected disciplines and perspectives that needs to be included into this new little subfield. And finally, you have black swans, which refers to highly improbable and highly unpredictable events that yet are very impactful, such as the financial crisis. And eventually, these two aspects inspired part 1 and part 2 of my final report. So yeah, as I dive into the literature, the very little literature there is, I discovered two things. First of all, as I said, this is quite shallow literature if you dive into it. And secondly, there are, fortunately, a few upcoming projects. There's 5 projects in the nuclear winter field that will, to different extents, address trade and supply chains. But that also made me question myself, how can I possibly contribute when you have more competent researchers with more resources? And in the end, came up with a theory of change. Don't bother reading all this. The short version is that I wanted to call it like a research memo or a report that I could send out to these researchers and also publish and send out to other researchers so that I reach people going into relevant fields in order to build a qualitative foundation to make sure that, one, we can start disentangling these complex systems, and two, we can make sure we include all the disciplines and perspectives that are needed. So yeah, then moving to part one, as mentioned before, I started, as all great researchers do, with a literature review, in which the focus is the second section, which is more of a systematic literature review, looking at the nuclear winter papers that actually address, TSC. And then second, I did an expert elicitation with researchers from the 5 research projects, and from these interviews I had like 3 interlinked key takeaways, as I call them. And the first and the second one really has to do with the complexity of the systems, once again. And the main takeaway here is that the strategy behind the approaches we choose are very important. And that refers to methodologies and also obviously the different disciplines we include, but also how we model, how we put together teams and such and so forth. I'll come back to that. And finally, the third one is also really much linked to the 2 first. These guys should probably talk together. It's a quite novel and quite small field, which means that all new findings can be very valuable for all projects involved. Then part 2 is more of a comparative analysis in 3 parts. First part looks at political economic aspects, and here I developed a framework for looking at trade in which capacity and incentives kind of facilitate the global trade. And I modified a World Trade Organization framework for looking at trading capacity, where I looked at human, production, infrastructure, and institutional capacity as building up an actor's ability to trade. However, many of the experts I talked to highlighted, call it political restrictionism or protectionism as one of the biggest hazards when it comes to food security in the nuclear winter scenario. As we've seen in recent decades, export restrictions and export bans can be very impactful in the global food system. So I try to suggest some frameworks for understanding how trade incentives work. Second section is shorter, looking at geographic aspects. Mostly looks at scenario specificity, which refers to, it's really a trade-off, but between, which I think we find in many research areas, between looking at more specific scenarios or geographic areas, then getting more accurate outputs that arguably could be more useful for, say, policy change, or on the other hand, look at bigger pictures and look at global scales, which gives you more universally applicable outputs, but then you do not have the same accuracy. And as an example of this, I looked at maritime choke and pinch points, as we mentioned in the last presentation. The final section is a multidisciplinary discussion, and here I really mobilized a lot of different disciplines to really show the value of including a lot of different perspectives and methods when looking at trade supply chains in a nuclear winter scenario. I looked at sociology, anthropology, psychology, even criminology and some business studies, and specifically I looked at how disaster risk reduction studies had incorporated these into their studies as kind of an analogy. And this obviously solves the problem of lack of epistemological diversity, but it also helps us with 2 of the main puzzling challenges here. The first one, again, of detangling systems complexity comes up again, and obviously then the idea here is, instead of sticking in with your, for example, economic model, and then you encounter a problem that has to do with politics or sociology, and you just think that, okay, we're just going to have to skip that. It's not within the scope. The idea is that by having larger teams and having more transdisciplinary approaches, you can actually incorporate this. And finally, I argue that this can help us paint the black swans grey, which refers to grey swans, which are also highly improbable and highly impactful events, yet a bit more predictable. And if we're able to paint the black swans grey, we have a much better, well, epistemic foundation for building resilience, I call it here, which is the goal, or hopefully the result, if we nail this. So finishing off with some thoughts on how we can move forward from this. This is a super simplified version of the very messy theory of change you saw earlier. You should probably use this instead. Anyway, I have 3 comments on this. First, I need to finish this research targeted output of mine, the research memo, if you want. Then, obviously, the important point here is that the upcoming research in the nuclear winter field addressing TSC will be improved. That is, doing a good job in disentangling the systems and including the needed disciplines and perspectives. And I will probably be partaking in at least one of these projects, which is very cool. However, this little stippled line here, I was hoping from the beginning that I could take this little shortcut in which this research target output would have some effect on policy, whereas I now see that that is quite unlikely. Therefore, I will go forward by working on a more policy targeted output, and although the semi-stippled line indicates that I have some uncertainties around that, I think that it can be quite impactful, because I think when it comes to trade supply chains in the nuclear winter context, we need both a strong research foundation and a strong policy foundation in order to build good resilience. Thank you.